over to you guys.
Thank you so much. Welcome. We'd like to welcome everyone to our session this morning. Your museum career, now what? Jane, I'm going to let you go ahead and share your screen when you get a chance. Excellent. We have a lot to cover in a fairly short amount of time. So we'll go ahead and get started with the introductions and then move through our piece. Next slide, please. For today's session, we've broken it down, trying to make sure we're covering the highlights of some really critical issues. We're going to have some in-depth dialogue as we go through, and then of course, a large amount of time at the end for your Q&A. We're going to quickly do introductions. We'll start with kind of returning to work issues. Those that are thinking about a job search post-COVID, whether you are employed or are currently unemployed, or even if you're a student coming straight out of school. We're going to talk a little bit about how you will prepare your materials for this search, dealing with the intricacies of virtual interviewing. I think we're all zoomed out, but there's still tips and tricks to learn. We'll talk a little bit about museum salaries. And of course, we're going to leave some time at the end for Q&A. We've already reviewed the initial questions that were put into the app, into the Q&A feature, and we'll try to make sure those are covered, as well as taking additional questions that will come through the chat. Next slide. Okay, we can go to the next one. I'll skip it. I won't give you all the brief speech about Arts Consulting Group. We're pleased that 3 of us on the panel are from Arts Consulting Group, but this is a wide panel that includes lots of different voices, different perspectives, and panelists from different regions with different roles and kind of outlook, if you will, on this topic today. I'll introduce myself. I'm Wyona Lynch-McWhite, your moderator today. I'm Senior Vice President at Arts Consulting Group. I'm based out of our Boston office. And I guess technically I like to say that I'm a recovering museum director. I joined ACG in 2016 after 21 years as a museum director, leading both art, university, and multidisciplinary museums, including 2 here in New England, Fruitlands Museum and Fuller Craft Museum. Now, since the WUVA app has downloaded my entire LinkedIn profile, I thought that was very cute, by the way, you'll see that I was a 2006 participant in the Getty Center's Museum Leadership Institute, and I currently serve as the past chair of the Leadership and Management Network of the American Alliance of Museums. My educational background is that I have a undergrad degree in photography from Florida A&M University, and I went on to get my MFA in photography at Columbia College in Chicago. And it was there in Chicago that I started my museum field, first working at the Museum of Contemporary Photography, and then at the Art Institute of Chicago. So that kind of ruined me for life. As I said, I'm based in our Boston office. I live west of Boston, and I'm still mourning the fact that there was no head of the Charles this year. Our next panelist is Maria Munoz-Blanco, who joined ACG in 2020. She brings more than 25 years of experience in the arts, culture, and public sectors, specifically within arts service, venue management, and grant making. Her work in public sectors has focused on improving the quality of life in diverse communities, expanding programs and services in the arts and parks, and successfully integrating the diverse voices of a broad spectrum of organizations and artists. Prior to joining ACG, she led public arts agencies in Dallas, Houston, and Memphis, managing multidisciplinary programs, capital projects, and public and private partnerships that benefited both arts organizations, museums, cultural centers, and the like. Maria has a Bachelor's of Arts degree in art theory from the University of Puerto Rico and a Master's of Arts in Art History from Rutgers. She is currently based in Raleigh, North Carolina. Maria, say hello.
Hello, everyone.
Next up, Laurie Davis. Laurie has been working in human resources at the Guggenheim Museum for the past 4 years, running recruitment efforts for all job functions at all levels of the organization. She also spearheads diversity, equity, and access and inclusion efforts and launched the formal learning and development program there last spring. Prior to joining the Guggenheim, Laurie was the managing director of recruitment at Teach for America and worked in career services within higher ed for a decade before that. She has experience in the corporate sector as well, having worked in global sourcing and production for Gap earlier in her career. Laurie has an MA in applied psychology from NYU and a BA in history from Duke University. She lives in New Jersey with her husband and 2 children. Laurie, please say hello.
Hello, everybody. Happy to be here.
Excellent. And last but definitely not least, Driving our panel today is Jane Hsu. Jane joined ACG also earlier in 2020. She brings 20 years of experience in museum and nonprofit organizational leadership. Prior to joining the firm, she was the head of engagement at the Rubin Museum of Art, where she managed creative and communication teams to produce compelling and unforgettable contemporary art experiences, accessible for all ages and diverse audiences. She also reinvented museum-wide high-impact engagement strategies by integrating contemporary art environments with an Asian American art museum. As manager of interpretation at the new Museum of Contemporary Art, she was key for community outreach activities when the museum launched its groundbreaking building in the Lower East Side. Jane holds a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree in Design and Video from Cooper Union and a Master's of Business Administration in Media Management from Metropolitan College of York, as well as a Master's of Arts in Film and East Asian Studies from Columbia University. And Jane is in New York City. All right, so I'm happy to welcome all of our panelists. Our first topic will be kind of discussing the return to work phase of the project. I will come back in as we go through to kind of keep us on track, but let's start with returning to work and what are some of the critical issues there. Panelists, I'll turn it over to you.
I'm happy to start on this one.
Okay.
I think, there's a lot to be said here. Everyone has had a really challenging set of several months here at this point. I can't believe it, how long it's actually gone on. I remember back in March when we closed the office and we all thought it would be 2 weeks and then back to normal, right? So I think it's been a big challenge, certainly for HR departments, to allow staff to feel supported and to keep morale up at a time when there have been layoffs and furloughs just everywhere, right? And that is really a challenge, I think, that institutions across the board are facing, not just in our industry, but in all industries. And I think, what's just important is that open communication, that employees feel that they at least are informed about what is going on, what they can expect. If there are going to be layoffs or if people are going to be furloughed, if they at least have a sense of timing, if there's reduced salaries. I know we're going to get into a salary discussion later in the panel, but there's a lot of salary reductions taking place. And I think this is bi-directional, right? Employees understandably want to get as much information as they can. And then I think on the management side, there's only so much information they actually have. And so I think it requires a lot of patience on the part of employees from understanding that sometimes we don't know the answers, right? That so much is up in the air. And so it's frustrating, but I think the only way that people can work together is to try and have that patience and recognize everyone is doing their best to just try and make things work. A lot of us are having to do more with less, and that's hard. But again, patience, I think, is the key here. And fortunately, a lot of institutions are open now, and that's helping a lot. So I'm going to turn it over to the others to add.
I think if I can add something to what Laurie said, my sense is that really learning to become more comfortable with ambiguity and uncertainty is what we are all having to do. And that's not particularly easy. And I think it's certainly if you have been very focused on collection management or registration work, working with objects curatorial, where there's a framework that you're very much used to working with, kind of developing that comfort level for sort of, when things are changing really fast and kind of in circles at times. And that's incredibly difficult. And I think, supervisors need to be much more aware than ever of the tone that they're talking to or with their team members. And team members also need to be a little bit more patient that this is all new for supervisors also. So kind of making that balance and becoming more comfortable and being very honest in the conversation. If you're feeling really uncomfortable with a task, with a new assignment, have that conversation one-on-one with your supervisor. I think that's really important as we kind of figure out how to come back into our fields and making the workplace more open to all.
Yes, thanks, Maria. That setting the workflow and the communication, I believe, is key because knowing when something's going to happen or when something's going to end or continue, it's going to be very difficult. So even if you have staff coming back to the actual workplace, maintaining some remote structure there could be helpful because you never know when you need to go back. And that will go for full circle because we're all working in public institutions. Being empathetic for your staff will help with understanding that visitor experience, because people have to first check, oh wait, are museums open? And then if they're open, what are the hours? Do I need to make a booking? And all the different ways we have to behave entering a public space. You know, all of that will also inform then how you adapt to the various policies for your visitors too.
Can you all talk a little bit to this paradox of working from home, right? So some institutions are bringing folks in staggered schedules. It's just been very different working from home, and not everyone will return to work fully. So can we talk a little bit about your thoughts on, as people make that shift, thinking about productivity, how working from home impacts collaboration, and things they should just be thinking about as they're returning to the office?
Sure, I'm happy to start with that. And I think, there's a lot of research out there about productivity and in-person versus virtual. And I think it really depends a lot on job function and the area in which you're doing. For example, technological support is much more easily done remotely, for example, than obviously something that's frontline staff related, right? Engagement and such. So, there's certain roles where it's imperative to actually be in the office, and others where I think it lends itself more easily to being virtual. I think what's tricky is there's a lot of people over the past several months who've said, like, wait a minute, I can do this from home. I don't really see the need to ever go back. That I've cut down my commute. I see my family more if I have a family. Maybe we could keep going with this. And that may be right. But I think there's also the counter to that, which is there's no quite real substitute for the type of communication and collaboration that you get in person. And so I'm hoping what institutions will start to realize is there has to be that balance. And perhaps if they've been able to see, okay, when people are here 2 days a week as opposed to 5, maybe we're able to get that in person. That's really important for building those relationships and that collaborative spirit, but yet give people flexibility that they need. And I think a lot of industries, not just ours, are reckoning with this of, do we want to stay remote? How do we balance health and safety versus productivity? There's no easy answer. I think, again, it really varies quite a lot. But I also feel, we have to recognize that there are people who don't have the appropriate resources to work from home. And so we also want to make sure that from an access perspective, we're giving availability to those who need a space to work from, because that can be, as challenging for others as the reverse. So just keeping all of that in perspective, again, comes down to communication with one supervisor. And I do think it's important on a macro level that we look at this research and say, what functions are required to be in person and what maybe doesn't need to be, and what's that appropriate balance?
Thanks, Laurie or Jane, anything to add to that?
I think one of the interesting sort of issues that management's going to have to deal with is this notion that for some people, they will be able to continue to work remotely, which has, a lot of advantages, as Laurie just outlined. But the frontline staff will not be able to do that. And I think there will be some health concerns, some sort of, your workday is going to become longer if you're a frontline staff than if you are somebody, doing back office work. And that are some of the issues that I think in terms of what we talked about earlier of morale and the logistics of operating a public facing organization are going to have to be really thought through. Which may involve, hazard pay for frontline staff. I don't know that that's something that the field has been talking about, but it certainly merits some conversation. So I think, again, returning to work partially in person, partially remote, all that stuff, it's are critical issues for management to be thinking about proactively as we are hopefully getting to the point that our world will be reopening, 2021, hopefully. So that's my thought here.
Thanks, Maria. Jane, anything for you before I transition us to this next one?
Just a quick add, when we're talking about frontline staff, people are coming in at all different hours. There's so many schedules and sometimes not looped into those departmental or all team meetings. So please make sure there's a place that frontline staff can check their schedules. What are the updated policies? Those change all the time. And keep everyone informed.
Thank you. One last thing on this one before we transition to the next topic. Well, maybe two. I think I do want to make sure we acknowledge something that Laurie touched on. Not everyone has the space to work from home, and not everyone who has been working from home remotely has done so in a way that's been really easy for them. I don't know any other way to say it. So when you think about staff trauma, there are a lot of people who are both trying to work from home, also being caregivers to either dependent children, to older family members. It's been very complicated. And I think there's been a lack of emotional awareness to the fact that that is draining on team members, draining on productivity and availability. I think that's just something that we have to acknowledge because it's going to impact how we build the strategies going back in. And I think you all alluded to that, but I think that also tags into our very last point on this topic. Let's talk a little bit about remote work and the generation gap here and how different generations in the workplace are handling this issue, who's having challenges, who's having successes, and what that might mean when it's time to kind of return to whatever the new normal looks like. Jane, I'll let you go first.
Also in that, you can assume that people in an older generation may be less in tune with all the software and all the possibilities in there than the younger generation. But again, I'm going back to that shared resource and having one place where all of this lives, and some kind of regular maintenance of when these, what people are using to get in contact with each other are updated, because it can be very confusing with the many different ways we communicate information. We all know how quickly news travels around a museum, especially internally, when something is not official yet. So please keep that in mind.
I agree with that, Jane. And I do think, of course, you can't always generalize, but I do see some generational shifts when, let's take, for example, if you're on a staff call or an all-staff meeting, it tends to be that the younger employees might be more comfortable following the chat while they're on Slack, while they're watching a presentation. And then you find other people who find that incredibly distracting, right? And so I think, again, it's important for people to check in with their teams and with their manager and to say, okay, this is what we're finding to be useful. This is what I might personally find distracting. I'd appreciate it if we, do this in this situation or do something differently in a different scenario, to follow different people's learning styles, because you don't want to do something that you're thinking is beneficial only to find out that in fact it's upsetting for others or that they're finding it confusing. So I just keep stressing the communication piece, but that is one thing, that multitasking piece, the texting, the slacking, the chatting, and so anytime you're going to set up a meeting, I think it's just a conversation to have in advance. Do we want to have an open chat? Do we want to have the chat only go toward the moderator so that that moderator can then present the chat at the end? Mm-hmm. What's the best way to have people feel engaged without it being distracting? Things of that nature. And I do tend to see a bit of a generational divide there.
Excellent. Maria, anything to add?
I was going to sort of relate a conversation that I had, as part of our work at ACG. We talk a lot with staff of arts organizations, and I remember a conversation not long ago with a team member at one of the organizations where she was very concerned about returning to work in the office. And she was relating to me how her younger colleagues were really eager to have that person-to-person, the chats around the water coolers, if those still exist in an office. And she was very concerned about her health and the fact that her younger colleagues were taking public transportation and how that would impact herself, and whether her organization would have the flexibility to understand that. So again, it goes back to making sure that we're very much aware of each individual's concerns and how we can be flexible enough to address those.
Wyona, there's a question in the chat. I'm happy to address it now, or would you prefer that we wait at the Q&A until the end?
Well, let's do it second, because I've also got one in the app. So this is what we call, I don't think I'm generationally sophisticated enough. So I've got questions in the app, questions in the chat. I'm going to try to get them all in. But there was a question about this, I think, within the earlier chat. The question was, do you see an expansion of positions within museums due to the pandemic? Will it take more resources or personnel to meet the requirements needed for exhibits, events, or educational needs? That was the question. I'll start the answer and then toss it over to you all in that For many of the folks that we've been working with who've been able to get back into their buildings and reopen in some way, it's been at such a reduced capacity, they've not needed to ramp up. They're actually just trying to bring back staff that's been furloughed under what we have seen. But Laurie, have you seen anything differently in your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely a lot of that as well. The one area I think some people are seeing some expansion is in digital, simply because so much of the work has transferred from in-person to online, particularly when, you know, museums were officially closed. And again, this is going to vary by state. And if we get shut down again, I think that's going to be a return. So I think digital is probably the one area where you might see, you know, some increased hiring. That and fundraising, you know, I think it's one of those areas where no one ever wants to contract fundraising teams in a time of hardship. So those are probably the two, but everywhere else, I think it's the opposite. I think everyone's being asked to do more with less because there just simply isn't the revenue or the resources to be able to support those teams.
Thank you. That's a good point. Now, the question in the chat, do you think that remote working can hinder new hires in their process of joining a new team and a new work environment or culture, perhaps especially for younger workers who have not yet had extensive experience establishing themselves within a marketplace? And I'll let one of you other folks chime in on this one, because I think we've seen lots of this over the last 9 months or so.
I think certainly it's making the way we relate to each other differently. So it's sort of, you know, if you are the new person on the team that has never met face to face with your team members, I think it takes a little bit longer to get to know sort of, you know, their body language, their communication style, all that stuff that you have to pay much closer attention to those cues from us, you know, as we talk to each other. So I think it is a little bit tougher to get that sense of culture. On the other hand, I mean, keep in mind that there's some industries that have been doing this virtually for a long time. So my sense is that getting, you know, step outside of the arts and museum world and read about how technology folks have been dealing with this forever, how other industries are sort of adapting to this and kind of start learning about how to deal with that situation. I mean, arrange some sort of, you know, 15-minute chats with your colleagues that are not necessarily work specific on a particular project or a task, but to get a sense, you know, ask them, you know, what's your background, what's your history with your organization, so that again, you can start feeling more part of the team. It's not easy. I mean, it's funny, Jane and I joined ACG at the beginning of the year, and we're a remote workforce, so we're kind of, you know, had to adapt to that. But the opportunities for us to meet on searches, which would have been a great place to sort of build more connection, we haven't been traveling as much. So I think that sort of, we have figured out other ways of getting to know each other. So adapt and learn new ways of doing things.
I'd love to build on that, Maria. When I was at Teach for America, we were also a fully remote team. And I think as a new employee, it was very challenging. I think, you know, you don't have those casual encounters of just asking someone, excuse me, is the restroom that way? You know, and then you see a face and then you say hello to that person in the hallway and then maybe you start a chat. So there's also less opportunity to just meet people across teams and throughout an organization. And that also affects interns. And I know a lot of our organizations, you know, have done remote internship programs. Same thing, you know, and when I was in career services, we would always tell the interns, you know, try to meet as many people across departments as you can and conduct some informational interviews, ask someone just for a cup of coffee so you can learn about, you know, their background and their skill set and what they do and if that might be something you'd be interested in doing. So all of that is much harder in an online environment. And I think a couple of tips I think that we can follow. One is for managers, if you have a new hire on your team, I think it's really important that you take that extra step to do some team building activities. You know, even some of the cheesy things, you know, make people take a personality test or ask them, you know, there's tons of forms of these out there if you look at, you know, onboarding materials, but, you know, your favorite color, the first place you ever lived, you know, something about that stood out for you in school, just all kinds of just getting to know one another types of activities. don't do work in that session. Really just try to get to know one another, so you can build up and people can get to know each other's personalities. And then perhaps if you have a new hire, giving them some structure in their first couple of weeks where they can have one-on-ones with people outside of your existing team, the people they'll need to collaborate with across the board, so that the burden isn't on that person as much, but you can help support and facilitate it a bit more. That's one suggestion. And then for people who are either new hires, full-time employees, part-time employees, or interns, I think the burden is also on you to reach out to people and do those sort of virtual coffee chats. And I found people are very open to this. If you just simply send an email and say, I'm new to the team, understand that you're working in photographic services or you're working in marketing and I'm working in education, would love to just hear about your work and get some of your institutional knowledge, because I am new to this place. And I think people are very amenable to that, and it can be quite helpful.
Those are perfect. Thanks, Laurie. Yeah, everyone needs it's not just the employee, it's also the supervisor as well. So thank you for those. Let us transition to the next piece of our discussion as we cover these points. And that's kind of getting ready to apply for a position post-COVID. So we'll flip to the next slide. And I think, we've got a variety of questions around that, but I think there are questions about, what do you do about your resume? Although we're going to talk a little bit more about application materials in just a second, but how you read the posting and just what people need to think about. Now, this is applicable for those that are freshly entering the field, as well as those that, as we have discussed, have been laid off or furloughed and are trying to return. So let's see, who wants to start? Do you guys want to talk a little bit about reading the job posting? Maybe that's a good place to start, reading that first before you get materials ready. Jane, how about you?
Yeah, sure. So, organizations spend a lot of time talking about what and all the ingredients they want in that position when you're looking at the job posting. There's so many pieces to it. And of course, there's always that mysterious line that says, and any other responsibilities that might come up, right? So please look at how the job posting has listings prioritized. And if possible, one thing, just going back to, when you think about working in an organization, we're working in museums. And if it's in your area, please go to the museum, have a visit, talk to the staff, get to know the space. You're fortunate enough to be applying for a position where you can actually kind of visit part of the office, right? And get to know the culture and have something personal to say then about your experience in your cover letter, or speak to that in your resume.
Excellent, thanks. Maria, how about you?
Well, what I would say in terms of, reading the job posting, it's, sometimes they're long, sometimes they're short, but do take the time to pay close attention to it. Make sure that what you're applying to is a position that you meet the qualifications. It doesn't have to be 100%, but it cannot be 10%. So you do have to bring the skill set and the experience that the position requires. And be honest with yourself. I mean, if you have spent, 3 years in working in a museum and the position posting requires 10 years, that might not be the best match. So that might not be a good use of your time, I think. At least that's what I've always sort of, done myself. That said, again, it doesn't have to be 100% perfect match. It just has to be close enough that your application will sort of rise to the top for the recruiters. So that's what I wanted to bring to your attention. The other thing, it's again, be flexible in, at this time where there's sort of limited positions available. You want to be open to possibilities in cities or communities that you may not have thought before, and having that sort of ability to look for those opportunities. I think it's really important in a very competitive marketplace.
Absolutely agree with that, Maria. That openness is so critical when it's a tight market. And going back to the reading the job posting, I always say the job posting is like the key to writing your cover letter. I mean, you just want to use that language and those skills to talk about what you have. But one thing I wanted to mention, as a lot of people might find themselves unemployed at this moment, is what I think we're all going to call sort of the COVID gap. And historically, people feel, frightened of a gap on their resume, that it's going to be challenging to find work if I'm not currently in work. I think that there's going to be a real difference in the way that recruiters look at this time period going forward. And we'll say, oh, it was 2020, right? It was the COVID gap. Totally understandable, because everyone knows what's going on right now. So I think the first thing is just not to be afraid and not to feel that because you were furloughed or that you were laid off, that means you're never going to work again. So it will be something that's an easy story to explain, and people will get it. That's the first thing I wanted to say. Secondly, using that lingo in the job posting to write your materials, we really want to focus on those transferable skills. So as Maria said, maybe you don't have 100% of every single job responsibility that's been mentioned, but that you've done something outside of the sector or in a previous career that you've had that really is quite relevant in terms of a skill set. I'm a career changer myself, and I actually find I love hiring people who have had a variety of different backgrounds, because I think they can bring a lot to the table and maybe have some outside ideas or outside perspective that those who have been sort of insular their entire career might not bring. So don't be afraid to apply for something. If you're so, well, I haven't done this for 20 years. Well, if you have 20 years of experience, even if something else is a little bit outside of the sector, really think about, wait a second, but I did do problem solving, or I have really been able to, cater to different markets, or whatever the case is. You've had those skill sets, and that's what you really want to highlight in your bullets, in your resume, and on your cover letter.
Thank you so much, Laurie. I do want to, before we go to this last one on self-identifying, I want to piggyback on what Maria said. As and I've certainly, presented at NEMA for years about thinking about equity in the workplace. And I'm, certainly would refer everyone to the Gender Equity in Museums project done by Joan Baldwin and Ackerson, these amazing folks who are going to be presenting at the conference. Please remember, when we talk about the requirements for a job and what they're listing for, I just want to be very clear. Research has shown that there's a gender issue as it relates to people believing they're qualified and choosing to apply. I want to say it's Harvard research, but doesn't always, everyone says it's Harvard if you're not sure who it is. But the research was that if there are 10 qualifications, a woman will wait to have at least 9 of the 10 to apply, and a man will apply if he has 6 of the 10. Something to that effect. Our whole point here is that we really do want you to pay attention to the qualifications in Maria's statement about thinking about use of your time. If there is something that's a requirement versus kind of an optional nice to have, we just want to, because you have so much energy that goes into preparing your wonderful materials. If it's a job, for example, that says very clearly that it has to have a master's, even if we don't think that's equitable, but if that's what they're requiring and it's a hard rule, could be union rules, could be any number of things, they may not have the capacity to hire someone without a master's. And so those kinds of things, we just think people should pay a lot of attention to. So I just wanted to put that out there, because we're certainly all about equity, but we want you to understand there are some things where employers have firm rules for why something is required. And as we think about equity, sometimes those rules are put in place to support an equity structure within an institution. So you just don't know. So let's talk about how to self-identify before you get ready to apply. Then next, we're going to transition to application materials. Jane, did you want to talk about self-identification? I forget whose topic that one was.
Yeah, it's something that we, actually we have all stories, and just speaking from my own perspective as an Asian American applicant, it's a tricky place to be when you're self-identifying, because you want to talk about your education, your qualifications, your experience. Should it matter what I look like, what my family background is for my job application? It's a difficult line, I think, for people to decide how much they want to self-identify. But I think it's really helpful in your cover letter to talk about, you don't have to have a whole paragraph about how your family immigrated here. Let's say for me from Taiwan, right? But I could talk about my experience, how my experience as an Asian American woman has helped me work with artists from the same background, let's say, or build a foundation that I work for Asian Cultural Council, that similar background.
Excellent. Thanks, Jane. Anyone else have anything to add there? No? Okay. Let's shift over to the next slide, which talks about application material. And I will say one bridge here is in the museum field. We do this a lot less than our colleagues in performing arts, but one bridge about self-identification in your materials is, do I put a picture on my resume? Should I put a headshot, right? And we do see that a lot in people who have really good, desktop publishing skills, and you see it a lot in the performing arts. We would tell you that's That's a personal decision. But for many people who are trying to implement a blind application process, the addition of your profile changes that. So generally the rule is that's not needed and not helpful. But I would say that's going to be your personal choice if you do that. Let's talk a little bit. So Laurie, let me lean back into what you were saying about this gap year. And there are lots of questions here about the fact that so many people are looking for jobs. So I'm going to let you talk about the gap year, and then keep in mind, we also have what advice do we have for recent museum studies grads who are looking to enter the workplace during or after a pandemic? So that's a different kind of, that's not really a gap year. They're looking to start completely. So.
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts. I mean, first, just just want to go back to the picture real quick. I'm not a fan of the picture on the resume, personally, because it takes up a lot of real estate, takes up a lot of space that I think can be used for other things. But to your point about blind interviewing, you know, a lot of places are now trying to implement strategies to eliminate bias, and the picture really is antithetical to that effort. So I will say you can have a photo on your LinkedIn profile. So if someone wants to look you up and wants to see what your background is, that's an appropriate place for it to be. But I still feel, you know, it's funny, internationally it's very different. There are a lot of countries overseas where it's standard to have your resume, and it used to be here in the States, if we saw an image, we immediately assumed it was somebody from another country. And then that has shifted, you know, again, a generational shift where a lot of younger people do put their photos on. But personally, for me, I would say no photo. In terms of the gap year, you know, again, I think I'm just, the point here was simply, if there's a gap, not to stress about it the way you might if you were let go in a different time period, because I just think people have to be more understanding about it, that it's not based on skill or value, but simply based on, you know, these absurd times and resources. In terms of the graduating students, I feel for you. I graduated in 01, which was, you know, we thought then that was a crazy recession, and that was nothing compared to 08, and that's certainly nothing compared to 2020. So, you know, we've seen some of these cycles, but this is obviously unique. I think what Maria touched upon earlier, which is you really need to broaden the search. And you can broaden things in two ways. You can say, okay, I want to stick with the museum industry, but be open to a different job function than I had planned on. So if you were really interested in curatorial, you might look at education. If you were really interested in, you know, a different area, you know, you might consider, like I said before, something in the digital space where there might be a little bit more opportunity. Look at where the jobs are, look at what you're seeing is available, and say to yourself, you know, is this something that I could do? And would I gain some skills that might in the future allow me to shift over to what I really want to do later? Because it's not easy, but it is certainly possible, especially if you're staying in touch with the right people and continuing to build that skill set. The other way to go is to change industries, or to at least be open to a different industry. I mean, even, you know, what we're doing right here, you know, many of you are in the arts consulting group. You know, you're not working at a museum, but you're leveraging, you know, museum backgrounds and all of that to enter the search space. So there are a lot of different places, you know, obviously there's the gallery arena, you know, for profit is obviously quite different, but tangential related fields that will allow you to really capitalize on your education and what you've just learned, but might just feel a little bit off from what your, you know, that original plan was. You're just going to have to broaden that search in order to be employed.
Thanks, Laurie. Marie or Jane, how about I let you go ahead and speak to that a little bit?
Also with pivoting your career, you know, it's difficult to think about your own life. But when you look at people heading museums and arts organizations, let's say you look at LinkedIn and you look at their whole history, their career trajectory, it's really interesting. They didn't start applying at museum company number 1 and moved in a nice linear path. They came from so many different places. And this is a time when people actually have a little more availability for you to contact them on LinkedIn, say, hey, I really, you know, I noticed that you made this transition 10 years ago and now you're here. Can we talk about that a little more? Just do a little homework when you do that, rather than, you know, looking just at their background, but what they did, and see if it's something that would translate to something you could do and you can make that connection with them.
Maria.
Sure, I can speak from personal experience. Actually, when you study art history, you think museums are sort of, it's the traditional career path. And I did start my career working in the museum field, and I wanted to do something different. And that's what got me into public administration. It was not necessarily that I set to have a career in government. I didn't even know there was arts within government. But I learned that early on in my career when I was hired to manage public art projects. That again, it's addressing working with a collection, it's addressing working with artists. It's sort of, there's a lot of commonalities between managing a public art collection and managing a museum collection, except that you have the elements to deal with. And then at some point later in my life, I sort of wanted to do something other than working in the arts, and I shifted and worked for about almost 4 years in the parks and sports recreation world, which was, again, I had a lot of venue management experience from performing arts facilities. And I was able to translate those to managing sports facilities. And yes, it's more complicated to manage a 57-seat stadium than it is to manage a 2,500-seat theater. But you know what? An event is an event is an event. And a lot of the same issues that you encounter. So you do need to sort of make a very convincing case and read about what is that sort of other field that you want to get into, or that you think that has some commonalities with museum world, so that you can then in an interview really make those connections for whomever's interviewing you, because they're not going to be the ones making it. You have to make the connection. So you need to talk about, same collections management that I spoke earlier. I think museum educators have a lot of room in other fields. Because of the way that you sort of touch into, multiple areas. You can talk about, education in the K-12 space. You can talk about training in the adult sort of corporate world. So again, it's really about take what you do and read about other industries and try to make those connections, because if you make them, whomever's interviewing you, it's going to say, oh yeah, it's going to pay more attention than if they have to make the connection on their own.
Excellent. Thank you. And I would say this seems to provide the answer for one of our questions that we've got in the app, which I'll just restate it to make sure the person who submitted the question knows we're trying to make sure this is the answer. That given that the pandemic has significantly reduced the number of available jobs in an already competitive field, many museum workers will likely be looking for jobs outside of the field, at least in the short term. And what are some opportunities for museum professionals to translate their skills to other industries? How can they take those experiences back to the museum field in the future? I feel like you guys have all spoken to that, but I would just say, as it relates to preparing your materials, your resume needs to not say what your title was. It needs to demonstrate what you did. And I think you've heard that through the panelists' commentary. So if you've been doing training, developing curriculum, leading groups, supervising staff, managing budget, those kinds of things that are completely transferable, they have to be detailed out. Often people really just list the title and don't think about what are the tasks of the job. You want an accomplishment-based resume, but you want to think about what are the tasks of the job. And that's what is transferable. I will say, as we get a little further into this, it does matter where you are on the trajectory of your career, but many people are able to transfer to adjacent industries and gain strong skills in things like marketing, fundraising. There's never enough fundraising, finance, other key administrative things that are completely transferable. But if you focus only on, collections management, that has a smaller bandwidth, but there is an adjacency to libraries, right? If you think about those, archives, archivist work, there is some connection. So it's really just up to you. So I'm going to mark that we've tried to answer that particular question. Jane, is there anything else before we transition to virtual interviewing? I guess one thing before I ask you to say that, please remember that the slide is correct. Everyone is looking for a job. It feels like that. And as museum-based professionals, there are more available jobs. Our friends and colleagues in other disciplines, the performing arts, music performance, they're closed and they are not even open to reduced capacity. So the marketing professionals who've worked for symphonies are now also looking at the marketing jobs for museums. So that's another thing to be aware of. There is additional pressure and competition in the marketplace. So we all understand that and have to be careful. Jane, is there anything else to add?
I'm good. Well,
You're good? Okay.
no.
We can go to the next slide. I think we answered the question, are we seeing increased opportunities for independent consultants now that museums are reducing staff? And I think you all spoke to that as we talked to the need for people that can do digital programming and other things of that nature. I think that's been the only space where we've seen really an expansion. So, okay, so I'll mark that one as trying to fulfill my conference mediation duties here. All right, let's talk a little bit about virtual interviewing. Which we would think everyone would know by now, but every week there's a new Zoom bomb story or debacle. So I guess we should cover that, because now the interview process can be completely virtual from start to finish. And there's some things people need to know. So who wants to start with some tips if you are the person doing the interviewing, as well as if you are the person being the interviewer?
I'll start.
Okay.
So yeah, if you are the one interviewing, to your point about the technology, I think the first thing is make sure you know the system that you're using. Remember, it's really your job to make the interviewee feel comfortable and have everything run smoothly. So, do your practice runs, make sure your tech is working correctly, and make sure that, of course, the candidate has all the information that they may need to be able to log on successfully. It's, nerve-wracking enough to interview. The last thing that poor person needs is to say, like, the person never sent me the link and I'm supposed to interview in 5 minutes. So, stay on top of your game, make sure that you give them the appropriate materials that they need in advance. While you're interviewing that person, I think, first of all, some grace, some patience, recognizing it can be awkward. It's hard to make eye contact virtually, if someone's looking at the camera and that doesn't look like they're looking at your eyes. So I think just an awareness that this is challenging on both sides for everybody. Obviously now it's been several months. I think people are a little bit more comfortable with it. But still, I think, you have to put yourself in the position of the candidate and recognize that they're nervous. And also that, as we talked about at the start, they might not have a great space to do this, and you don't want to fault somebody for that. I think we've seen it happen where a manager says, oh, I was very distracted during that interview because the candidate's dog was barking in the background or because the space was distracting, and judge them based on that, which I don't think is fully fair, because that person simply may not have had any opportunity to find a quieter space. Obviously, if you are the person interviewing, try your best to come up with that. Maybe you need to leave the dog outside for that hour if it's not too cold or if it's not raining, or, put the kids in front of Disney Plus for the 10th time that day. Whatever it is that you need to do to be able to have that quiet. But I do think everybody just needs to give each other a little bit of grace on both sides. For those who are interviewing, in addition to trying to make sure that your technology is working properly, that you've tested it before, make sure, I would always say to the person, can you hear me all right? Am I coming through clearly? The same with the phone interview, making sure that the connection is strong. And then again, just slowing down a little bit, making sure that you're coming across as clear, that they're able to understand, your points. Sometimes it's nice to just say, was I able to address that question? And that goes for in-person as well as virtual. But I think what's most challenging is that body language piece, right? That you can't necessarily read into what someone is feeling. Sometimes people, in person, you can sort of tell if they've had enough of that answer and they want you to stop, or if they're leaning in because they want to get more. And so that's just an extra challenge. I think what's even harder is if it's more than one person interviewing you digitally at the same time. And so I would just say to that, if you have 2 or 3 people on a screen and they're all interviewing you, sometimes they might piggyback on each other, and it's perfectly okay to say, you know what, I think I'm going to, if it's okay, I'll address Wyona's question. And then I'm so sorry, but Maria, would you mind repeating the part that you had asked? So clarification is perfectly fine. Slow things down a bit. Make sure that you're able to address what each person is asking. And do your best. Again, everybody recognizes that it's a little bit of a challenge. I would also say, dress up, take a shower, put on earrings, make yourself feel like you're actually going into an office. These things seem somewhat sort of superficial or silly, but psychology shows us that it actually does impact your mood, your energy level, if you really follow a routine as though you were going to sort of get up and go out to a workspace. So sure, you can be wearing pajamas on the bottom half and no one will ever know. But you know, even if you put on a fancy pair of shoes underneath the table just for you, that you sort of feel like I'm on my game. Again, sort of sounds silly, but it really does have an impact. So dress the part, feel confident, have your notes near you. I mean, the one benefit of a virtual interview is that you can actually have up on your screen, you know, the company's mission statement or their website. If you have a dual monitor, you can have some notes or a piece of paper. So you don't have to memorize as much. You don't want it to seem awkward that you're reading, obviously, during an interview, but just as a crutch for you to make sure that you have those tips ready for you. So that's something else that could help.
Now, Laurie, those are really good, but I have to tell you, I'm going to need folks to put on pants. I just need you to get fully dressed. I can't tell you the number of people who have to stand up and adjust a camera or something weird happens, and I'm going to need you to be fully dressed. Is that okay? Can I say that? I'll also refer you all to a great meme that's going around on Facebook. This gentleman's getting ready for his video interview. He's literally taped the cat to the wall. Now, of course, we don't condone animal cruelty, but all pets really love Zoom calls for whatever reason and will want to come and be a part of the call. Is that true for my colleagues? Yes. Yeah, that's what we've noticed. Maria or Jane, anything else to add on those wonderful interviewing tips from Laurie?
Well,
Yeah, I would say,
go ahead, Jane.
I would say that with the group calls, it can be complicated. So as the interviewer, make sure if it's more than one person, let the candidate know who's going to be on the call. And if you're the candidate and you're not sure who's going to be in a call, ask. Because sometimes, you know, on Zoom, they'll just say, oh, Jane, that's my identification. Don't know if I'm part of the board, I'm part of the staff, and get to know who's on the call. And then once you get to know them, look up a little bit what they do. And if you can, to make it a little bit more personable, refer to their names. Thank you, Maria, for your question. Oh, adding to Laurie's comment, that just gives it a little bit more of that real feel.
Thanks. Maria, go ahead.
Well, what I was going to add is, you know, quite a few of the sort of, you know, LinkedIn and Indeed, all those sites sort of have a lot of recommendations on how, as an interviewee, you can do better. And, you know, one of the things that they're constantly recommending is that you look at the camera, which I'm trying to do. But it's incredibly distracting not to be able to look at the person's face who's asking you the question. And I think we're becoming more comfortable with that sort of shift of looking at the camera, and then you look at the person as a way of sort of, you know, keeping the conversation going. But do spend a few minutes kind of looking at those resources that are on LinkedIn and a few other places, because I think they're helpful. Now, the other thing that I was going to say in virtual interviewing, as in in-person interview, try to keep your answer germane to the question. When they're asking you about your background and you know that there's only an hour in the interview and you know they're going to have a whole bunch of questions, don't spend half an hour talking about your third grade teacher and how he or she inspired you to you know, become a museum professional. Because we've seen that happen, and Wyona's smiling because we know exactly who we're talking about. But I think it is really important, again, to sort of pace yourself. There will be questions, and sometimes they will tell you, I have 10 questions to ask you. So use that information to, again, to keep your answers tight. Don't be just, you know, 2 words. I mean, elaborate a little bit, but keep your answers tight and to the point so that they know that you're somebody who's listening to what you've been told the interview is going to take, and also, again, kind of frame it in the context of the organization that you're interviewing for.
And
Thank you for that. Yes, Laurie, go ahead.
Back real quick. Yeah, Maria, with the third grade, yeah, we see stuff like that a lot in cover letters as well, too. You know, ever since I was a child, it's been my dream to blah, blah, blah. And I would be cautious of those words, you know, love, dream, you know, things that just seem a little bit more flowery. You know, I think it's perfectly fine to say that, you know, you've been an avid museum goer for your entire life and it's something that's very important to you, but you can use different language. I think it's a bit more elegant to talk about that. The other thing I wanted to touch upon was the diverse hiring piece. And I would say, you know, for those who are conducting interviews, interviews, I really recommend a structured interview, which is where you ask the same questions to all of your candidates in the same order and use some sort of a rating scale for the answers, where you know what you're looking for and the points that you want to come across of each one. Because if you just get into one of those very lax conversational conversations like, oh, you know, you went to Duke, I went to Duke, oh my goodness, you know, did you live in North Carolina for a long time? It's nice, it makes a person feel comfortable, but what tends to happen is that really leads to bias, because then the interviewer is saying, I like this person because this person is like me and we have something in common and it's easy to speak with them. That has absolutely no predictive factor on how they will perform on the job. Because I like you and we have something in common doesn't mean that you're going to excel in a role that, by the way, might have absolutely nothing to do with me who's in HR, you know, whereas you might be someone in a completely separate department. So I really caution people in terms of interview bias to get into those conversations. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't start with some icebreaker questions to make the person feel comfortable and ask a couple questions just to, you know, make them, again, just seem human. But I'm saying that you should have the same set of questions that you're asking of all candidates.
Good point, Laurie. We couldn't agree more. As we're also talking about some of this, now that we're actually doing the interview, I do want to make sure we touch on a little bit in that while Maria has shared, there's tons of Zoom tips or video interview tips, but we're still seeing people do a couple of things that are against best practices when it comes to virtual interviews. Often one of them is trying to use your phone for that process. It's very rare that your phone works as well as the desktop application. But if it does, many people are having it on their desk or something to that effect, and they're staring down into it, which everyone tells you certainly not to do. And I know it seems very basic, but people keep doing it. So you're not supposed to have a silhouette. You're not supposed to have, you know, a window behind you. You're not really supposed to use your phone. That's not ideal. It needs to be something up and at eye level. And as we said, you just have to check the tech. Now, it should be obvious, but it happens so often, I feel like it just can't be said enough. One other thing, a colleague on our questions gave us the feedback that earlier we discussed pictures on your resume, yes or no, and most of us say no. Someone said that it's actually illegal in the state of Massachusetts to have your photo on your resume. So I want to pass that along. I didn't know it was illegal. Certainly it's not advised, but that probably goes to the hiring bias. This also, we'll get to salary in a minute, but before I forget, when we talk about salary, in many states, it's illegal to ask someone about their past salary history. In Massachusetts, it's one of those states. Is there anything else we want to share, guys, about virtual interviewing? Have we covered that correctly? I don't think I have many pictures in the chat. Everyone seems pretty hip to the virtual thing. So we're going to get fully dressed. We're going to lock the dog out of the room. We're going to have front lighting. We're going to be ready to go. And if we are the person conducting the interview, we're going to make sure we're following a process that gives every interviewee a fair shot, right? By asking equitable questions and the same questions, right? And being very thoughtful about that. That's perfect. Oh, I will just say this. If you are the person conducting the interview, if it's a group interview, every member of your team, if they're on separate cameras, should have their camera on, right? You should be as physically present as you would in the room. It's disrespectful to candidates, although we've certainly heard about it, where people who are conducting the interview cannot be bothered to be physically on the screen. That's just not appropriate. So if you're going to show up for the interview, show up fully. If you're interviewing, be physically present, just like the candidate is. Should we move on to our next topic? We're going to talk a little bit about understanding museum salaries, where there's plenty of questions. No shortage of questions on this one. Surprise, surprise. Let's see here. I'm going to start with a couple on the chat, and then we'll piggyback with what's on the slides. I think we're going to cover them. So what's the outlook for salaries in addition to jobs now that the pandemic has hindered visitation as well as funding? Let's start with that one. Who wants to take that one?
Well, I can start. My sense is that salaries at this point in many places are partial. There might be fewer hours allocated. There might be sort of across the board reductions. And my sense is that that's not going to stop in the next few months. I suspect this will carry over to 2021. It's just the reality of where we are, where organizations are really struggling to find reliable sources of revenue. And I think the donor community has certainly helped out. And I think certainly federal PPP loans helped out for a while. But that's not necessarily that's not sustaining for the foreseeable future. Donors are going to start experiencing their own issues and tiredness of giving. So my sense is that salary reductions are here for the next few months, if not 6 or 7.
Thank you for that. So let's go ahead and jump into that's a nice piggyback. I wanted to ask that first because it goes right into our question on salary research. There's a lot of dialogue about trying to understand salaries, trying to make sure you as a potential candidate for the salary would be offered a fair one. So there's lots of little bits and pieces in here. And I'm going to just give each of you a chance to kind of speak to this and talk about what are some of the current issues you're seeing, things that people who are applicants should be aware of, and really understanding where this all falls. Jane, I'll let you go first.
Sure. So the first step, you're interested in this organization and you want to research what's a fair salary for this position. So you can look up the 990 on the organization. And it's going to be tough this year, as Wyona mentioned, because museums have their whole history of what they're paying their high-level employees. You can look up their expenses, the size of the budget of the organization, up until, everything will change from this year. So keep that in mind, but it gives you a foundation of where to begin and also the nature of how the different positions are organized.
Excellent, thank you.
I mean, a couple of things. There is that Google sheet that is fairly easily accessible where different museum professionals have been sort of putting their own salaries or salaries that they're aware of. And that's certainly a resource that you can look at. If it's a public sector position, there's likely a salary range that is posted publicly. And if it's a public employee, many times the local newspaper will publish their salary. So there's many ways that you can, do a deep Google search and find out comparable salaries for those positions or the salary of the former incumbent. So those are a couple of the ways. Now, when it comes to salary ranges, keep in mind that it's not always the top end of the salary what's realistic. You might want to sort of look at midpoint and below as to what tends to be the entry level salary or the starting salary of a position. So those are some of the things to keep in mind when you're looking for salary comparisons. Now, there's also studies that various professional associations conduct periodically. I don't know if the AAM salary is available publicly. I think you have to buy that report, but you might check your public library. They may have a copy of it. But others are easily accessible on the professional organization's website. You can also sort of do it, if nowadays, a lot of the professional associations are requiring that salaries be posted as part of public postings. So that's another way of, again, getting a sense of what the marketplace is bearing these days for particular positions.
Before Laurie jumps in, I'll just say that NEMA does an awesome salary survey, which takes data from the field, and everyone should certainly be participating in it. It's a really good tool. What Maria mentioned was the broader American Alliance of Museums survey, which covers all of the regions, not just NEMA, although NEMA helped facilitate putting that together a couple of years ago. That's a great resource, excuse me. I'm not a fan of that museum salary one because it's not verifiable. So that is, that's me personally. We do not have any way to prove that these are correct ranges, but you're welcome to look at it as an informational point. Laurie, what are your thoughts on salary research?
Yeah, so I think you guys have covered a lot of the resources. There's also, Glassdoor and payscale.com and some of those general ones, but just a word of caution, we have up on the slide here, the meaning behind a title, location and title and size of institution. There's so many variables. So a director at one institution could mean literally very, very senior level, whereas at another institution, there could be 300 directors. So, I think you have to just be cautious when you look at these resources to see, is that actually apples to apples with the position to which I'm applying? And make sure that you go on the organization's website and look at their staff page, and you can see, oh, okay, the top person is called the executive director, and then, you know, there's deputy directors or senior directors or whatever their nomenclature is, because it does vary so much. And some people might say like, oh my God, how is it possible that there's such a large discrepancy between a director here and here? And then you actually come to find out one person has a team of 3 and another person oversees a team of 20. So I think that's just, you know, something to keep in mind. I would also say when you're applying for jobs, oftentimes the job application form will ask you, what is your salary requirement? And this is a tricky one. It can be used, it's more often used to screen out, meaning, let's say I'm posting a job and the salary is $80,000. If someone applies and in that salary requirement box, they've asked for $200,000, I'm not going to bother contacting that person. One, there's no way you're going to get from 80 to 200. That gap is way too massive. But 2, it means that they really don't even have an understanding of the level of this job or what it is, because it's so outlandish, right? That person just wouldn't be considered. On the other hand, if there's a gap of 10,000, even 20,000, and someone is quite competitive or really has the, you know, the correct skill sets for a job, you know, a good recruiter should reach out to that person and say, look, you know, this is what I always do, is reach out and say, you know, we saw your application, we'd really like to consider you, but I want you to recognize that we're never going to be able to meet quite that salary requirement that you've requested. Are you at all flexible? So I think the key here is just put what you actually believe is fair and important to you and what you want, but do that research first so that you're not putting a number that's so thrown off, you know, that it's going to affect your ability to be interviewed or to be contacted.
Thanks, Laurie. That's really important. And I would say the meaning behind a title is also critical. People can have similar titles and very different scopes of responsibility across different institutions. I think that's also difficult for people to understand. So really knowing where you want to be is really important. Let's transition a little bit to talking a little bit about posting salaries on a job description. As one of the panelists has already shared, many posting boards do require that. They'd like to have a range posted when a job goes live. And that's really great as it relates to salary transparency. Salary transparency is not the same as pay equity. And so I want to just put that out there. There's a whole discussion there if that comes up as an issue, because many people are certainly concerned about it. Our point here is that if an organization has not posted a range, I just don't think it should be interpreted as any sort of malfeasance on the institution's part, right? For our part, we want to make sure that postings are out there because that provides access for all of us that are looking for work, right? All of us looking for work should be able to see what's available and that it's out there. And so for us, that access is really important. But let me ask the team to kind of weigh in on thoughts or either things to be aware of or look for when it comes to posting salaries on a job description. Laurie, how about I start with you? Because you probably have seen this in every manner in your region.
Sure. Yeah, New York, it's all over the place. I will say, by the way, New York is also one of those states where it is illegal to ask an interviewee, what is your prior salary or what are you currently making? You are not allowed to ask that. And the reason, of course, is because regardless of what you're earning now, that should not dictate whatever is the fair wage for the position to which you're applying. So just wanted to put that as an aside. In terms of the posting, yeah, I mean, I think it varies by institution. There are some in the school of thought where you should post it, you want to be transparent, you want people to know. But there's also, you know, it can be tricky when, for example, you're posting something that's an endowed position and therefore that salary might look very different than others that are similar, or a grant funded position, or it simply might be that the type of place that doesn't post is because there is a range and they fear that if they put that number out there, you know, that it might dissuade people who feel like they're not at that level yet from applying, or on the opposite side, if they find a candidate that they can make a really compelling case to senior management, we can try to scrounge and find some more money for, that they really want to fight, you know, that might dissuade those people from applying if they see, oh, there's no way I'm going to apply for that job if it's only X amount. So I think, you know, from the institution side, they can see it as limiting to post it. But of course, the other camp is, but it's also very transparent to post it and people should have that information. So I've seen, you know, both sides of the coin there. I don't think there's a clear-cut answer.
Jane and Maria, anything else to add to that one?
Just something, a small point in regard to the range. About every week, I go through a lot of interviews. I hear from somebody, well, let me just request something on the lower side of the range, or let me just lowball myself. I want to have better chances at getting this position. And I don't think that's helpful for you. I think you have to show that you do the research for the position, offer what's a fair expectation for your background as well as the job.
I can add, I mean, when you're answering that question, don't just put the word negotiable. Give the organization, what are your parameters for that negotiable? If you know that if you're going to move to Chicago, the only way you can make it work, it's to have a salary that is, you know, 80,000 and above. But this is $1 million organization that's looking for an entry-level curator. You want to be realistic within the space that you can negotiate, because I mean, it is, you work for a living, so you do have some realities that you have to consider. So so be open, but don't short sell yourself.
Good point.
I wanted to add one more piece, if I could, Wyona, which is about the job function. You know, people will say a lot of the times, well, our curators or exhibition managers and, you know, our educators are, you know, really the soul of these institutions. You know, why is it that they might be making less than someone, you know, in a back office position of finance or IT or something along those lines?
Mm-hmm.
I think we have to remember simple supply and demand, that if you are a finance person or an IT person, you can get a job in any sector, right? You can find a job outside of the museum field much more easily than someone who is highly specialized and really has a more narrow range of employment opportunity. So I think historically, we've seen that, you know, if you want a good marketing person or you want a good finance person or technology person, what have you, those people could be making more in a for-profit industry. They might be choosing nonprofit because they're more genuinely interested or their values are aligned or what have you, and therefore they're going to realize they'll have a little bit of a salary hit. But it's harder to get good talent from people who have the opportunity to go to for-profit versus people that are limited to where they are. That's unfortunate. I think that's a real challenge in our industry, but I just wanted to call it out for the reality that it is.
No, I think it's good feedback. It's good. And piggybacks on what we talked about earlier as people think about shifting in and out of the field. There are some of those positions that have cross-sector usage. And we talked about finance, but also, as we said before, fundraising. A competent fundraising professional it has a wide open career path in many different sectors, as long as they can prove, you know, a track record of accomplishments, right? That's just, you have to be able to prove you can do the work. I think we've already answered certainly the question that employers cannot in most states ask you what you're currently making. What they can ask you in written or verbal form is what you would hope to make for that role. And I think our panelists have all shared, please know what you think your range is, and don't be afraid to share that. I just think that has to be stated. We've also talked a little bit about the research. And so I just want to be clear, because I don't know where everyone is on the career trajectory. We've got some newer folks who've asked questions who are coming out of school. So just clarifying, when we say you can see it on the 990, what we're saying is on the public funded, the public posted 990s, you can see the top 5 or so, any position that makes more than 100,000, I think they cap it at 5, but those salary ranges will be shared. That's your presidents, your higher level directors. If you're looking for a more junior level position, that statement would not be as useful to you, which is then to say, please look at things like salary surveys. Laurie mentioned Glassdoor and other things where you can get a sense of, if I'm looking for a marketing manager job in Manhattan, what are the ranges, and hopefully by budget size, right? Because often the salary is very connected to the budget size of the institution. A museum that has a budget under $1 million will pay very differently for a marketing director who will likely do a much broader range of tasks than a museum that has a budget of 25 million, right? It's a very different sort of thing. So I just wanted to put that out there. And I think we've covered posting everything else. Panelists, is there anything else that we have not covered before I shift over to some of the Q&A things here? I guess, actually, let me think about this. Doing the research before you applied, the divide between essential and non-essential personnel was the one thing we did mention in our kind of summary. I think we've covered that. Laurie spoke to that a little bit as it relates to people who are more specific to the field. I think that's probably covered. Okay. Panelists, is there anything else that we want to share before I quickly make sure I cover the remaining questions in our Q&A. By the way, if you've not put a Q&A question in the little app, you can do so on the screen in that Q&A box. There's a way for you to do that, and we can read them live.
So I was going to add, Wyona, that while employers cannot ask you what salary you're making, you can certainly volunteer that as part of the conversation if you think it's appropriate. You don't have to, but it does not preclude you from volunteering it. They just cannot ask you.
Excellent. All right. Okay, so let's see a couple of the questions we've got here. Now, I thought so what would your advice for job searches post-COVID? No, let me back up. Would your advice for job searches post-COVID also apply to internships in the museum field? Is there a different approach or additional information that we should think about? I feel like we've answered that question for the interns. Is there any additional tidbit that might make this search process different if you were looking for an internship versus a full-time job?
I mean, I think we touched a lot of it in terms of being open to different sectors and to not being afraid that if you intern at a non-museum that you'll never be able to work in a museum again, especially this year. There's a lot of chatter about unpaid internships and, the inherent inequity in that. And so a lot of places have really moved towards paid only internships. However, given everything that's been happening, those internship programs have been consolidated drastically. So it's much, much more challenging to find an internship, unfortunately. So again, I think, as Maria touched upon earlier, even from her own career, thinking about tangential sectors, looking at opportunities of things that are more outdoors might be a better approach right now for the next few months. Parks and recreation is a good way to go. But yeah, I think, again, the biggest advice for anyone who's in school, just network, conduct as many informational interviews as you can, get on LinkedIn, find people in the field, start those conversations so that when things do open up again, you're front and center and ready for that next opportunity.
Excellent. Jane, anything to add?
Yeah, I would say, in our field, every single position is a public-facing position in some sense, and there's an education component to it. So look for opportunities where you can work part-time. Internships, the great thing is you're not locked into one internship if you get one, right? Have 2 or 3 at a time, or one volunteer opportunity, one internship opportunity, just to get used to speaking to people, listening to audiences, hearing what they want. It doesn't have to be in a museum.
Excellent. Good feedback. And I would just say, if you are on the other end of the spectrum and you're the institution that needs some help and might be able to engage an intern, that it's really critical that you understand that they deserve a meaningful experience where they're actually gaining skills, right? And learning the field and doing real meaningful work. That's really critical. And of course, we believe it should be compensated. And some institutions do not necessarily have the capacity to pay an hourly rate. They do stipends, whatever. But I just think we all agree that this is critical work, both in what the interns give to our institutions and how we should be valuing them, and that it definitely should be compensated. So I just want to put that out there, because not everyone's going to be able to pay the full-time rate, but you really should be compensating. Yeah, that's an issue. That also speaks to diversity and equity within our broader museum field. Many people have dialogued before COVID that one of the reasons our field has trouble attracting diverse professionals into it is that we have low paying wages. We're considered a pink collar field, and so our wages are a little bit lower. And then we're expecting people to work in internships and other things that have zero compensation, which is not attractive to a diverse range of candidates. Now, team, before I let you guys go, the last question we've got is one, I'm going to read it. Do you think that policy groups or other organizations could prove fruitful avenues for museum professionals, given our hands-on experience with conveying a variety of information, right? Especially given the current political climate and the need to preserve the place of museums as a place of public trust. So now that's a tricky one, but if I think what you're understanding, do I think policy groups or other organizations are transferable areas for museum skills? I would say yes, wouldn't everyone? So associations, anything that's got that, to Jane's point, public facing piece would be attractive potentially. Yeah,
I just would put one caveat to that. And this, this could be broadened to a lot of different areas, but sometimes when people see on a resume a particular party affiliation or a
Oh,
policy
yes.
group that's known for having certain viewpoints that may be different from those that many of the museum hold, there can be room for bias there. And it's just the reality, right? On whatever side it may be. That being said, you know, you may not want to work for a place that would bias against the particular experience that you brought, you know, and that you hold valuable to yourself. So it just, you know, we're saying, I've had students who said, you know, should I put that I was on, you know, that I worked for a congressperson from a particular party or a controversial figure or something along those lines.
Mm-hmm.
Still very valid experience. And I think if you can speak about it in transferable skills way, that's great. But you do have to recognize you may get someone who views that in a negative way if they think that it's counter to the culture of their particular team or their particular organization.
That's great feedback. Thanks for sharing that. It's good to think about, especially in our current mega divided climate. Jane and Maria, anything else to add to that? No.
I mean, just to echo what Laurie said, that I think policy organizations that are broad enough, that are really sort of nonpartisan, are certainly a wonderful opportunities. I mean, there's a lot of thinking, a lot of research, and you know, research organizations talk about a skill set that museum professionals really have. It's the ability to research and analyze and pay attention to detail. I think policy organizations really value that. So that is a good opportunity to be looking in sort of an adjacent field of sorts. But you know, with some caution on the notion of partisanship and how that might be perceived as or could be a bias for those that are reviewing resumes down the road.
Thank you for that. Good point. So I think I want to just quick do a summary. I want to thank our panelists for being with us today. We were hoping that we helped you think about either relaunching, restarting, or just jumping into a career search in the museum field. And our hope is that through our dialogue and conversation today, we've helped you think about, you know, first and foremost, doing your research for the kind of position you're looking for, what you expect the salary range to be, preparing your materials. We've talked about your resume. We've talked about a little bit about like your LinkedIn profile and other social media things, but let me just piggyback that here to say, it goes without saying in the 21st century, your digital footprint is just as important as that resume that you're going to submit. So you need to make sure, especially in light of that, these last discussions around partisanship, that you have a nice, neutral, clean public profile that presents you the way you want to be printed. And I should say that neutral is your choice. You may not choose to be neutral. You don't have to be neutral, but just make sure you understand what your public profile says, as employers will be able to see that. People can see your Facebook pages, your LinkedIn pages, and so forth. So that's really important. We've talked a little bit about the resume. If there's additional questions about formatting your resume or any specific questions, our information is up here on the screen. We're happy to provide any support we can as you think about that as a template. And then we've also talked about the kinds of positions that'll be essential as we're returning to the institutions, which one may not be, what things you might be thinking about as you're thinking about stepping out of the field or just looking for opportunities until the field is more restaffed 100% once we're through this COVID climate. So I hope that's been helpful. I just again want to thank our panelists for being with us. We have no additional open questions, so I think we have done our job. And I want to thank everyone who joined us virtually in this format. I hope that it was very helpful to you. I'm going to give everyone on the panel one last second to say your final words for the group. And I'll start with you, Jane, then Maria, and then you, Laurie, in the order I see you on the screen. Jane, please go ahead.
I want to thank Nima for inviting us to participate and talk today, and I'd love to continue the conversation with you. You have my contact information as we are all working together to take another look at how our field is changing and ever expanding.
Thank you. Maria?
Well, again, thank you to Nima, and thank you to all of the participants. And if, you know, parting words from me would be, don't be afraid to sort of, you know, step your toes into a different field. There's some wonderful opportunities out there that could really sort of expand your skill set. And then when the museum world sort of stabilizes again, you'll be a more competitive applicant.
Thanks, Maria. Laurie?
Yeah, same here. I want to appreciate all of our listeners today, and thanks to the Arts Consulting Group for inviting me to this panel. I hope that it was helpful for everybody, and just everyone hang in there. We will get through this.
Good words, Laurie. Yeah, hang in there. Thank you for being a part of this wonderful and fruitful conversation. And for those out there on the webinar, just remember, any one of us is happy to provide support and research to you in your search, no matter where you are in that transition. Just know that you're not alone. And as Laurie said, hang in there. It will get better. Thank you so much for watching. This concludes our session, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of the conference and the amazing program that's going to take place over the next couple of days. Thank you.